Good morning, everybody. I'm so thrilled to be here. I want to thank Scott and also Trina and all the folks at the Phoebe Institute on Aging who have been welcoming and wonderful to deal with in all of the months in which we've been anticipating this morning, but it's so exciting to actually look at you and you're here. So I'm a little curious about who's here. So I'm wondering if you could just stand for a moment if you are a healthcare professional. Bless you. You can be seated. Oh, that was my rabbinic. I don't get to do that very often. Okay, stand for a moment if you are a social worker. Bless you. Stand for a moment if you're a member of the clergy or a chaplain. Or raise your hand if standing is difficult. Thank you. Who did I miss? Stand if you're a student. I hope we're all students in some way. Thank you. Bless you. And stand if you are aging. That was a trick question. That's very interesting. I wonder about the rest of you. I once went to a conference and I saw somebody who had a button that said, "Aging, aren't we all?" We are, in fact. In this beautiful place, this building, Congregation Bethel, which really represents somehow that capacity to cherish that which is old and embrace that which is new, I want to invite you this morning to join me as we map the territory of the spiritual journey of later life. I hope that we can together come to understand both the challenges and the opportunities of growing older. I've been accompanying others through the terrain of later life for most of my life. Back when I met Cantor Wortel, I was already working with elders in a nursing home context. And the thing was, when I was a newly minted rabbi, I was working with the very old and I was very young. And something strange has happened because then old age was very far away. And as I've aged in aging, it's getting closer all the time. So when I speak to you about the journey of aging, I'm speaking to you about my journey as well. The path in later life is rich and complex. I've been struggling for many years to find a way to hold the complexity of all that growing older contains, because we might have decades of good health, vigorous activity, and fruitful engagement. And we are also likely to confront limits and loss, illness and dependency. Of course, as we all know too well, we'll inevitably confront mortality, ours and our beloveds. I was interviewed for a newspaper recently, and the reporter said, "What do you tell people about death, about dying?" I said, "I tell them that the chances are 100%. I'm continually awed by the radically varied ways that individuals walk this path and meet the blessings and the vicissitudes along the way. I want to tell you about my neighbor, whom I'll call Betty. She's in her 80s, and she's known throughout the community for her distinctive appearance as she walks in the woods for miles every day, swinging the cane she carries but refuses to use. Betty has broken every bone in her slender frame. When she had the most recent in a series of major surgeries a couple of years ago, she recovered enough to walk, more slowly and less far. But Betty is furious, consumed with rage, complaining constantly about the things she used to do that she can no longer enjoy. Her husband and her kids are suffering along with her and from her. There's my friend Jeff, an amazingly talented man who poured his whole self into his professional work in the community. When he retired, he invented a new life as he took up painting and became a serious student of Musar, the Jewish ethical teachings. He revels in the passionate engagement that fill his days. He's grateful that both painting and Musar have given him what he calls a new angle of vision. And then I want to tell you about my beloved mother-in-law, Miriam, a Holocaust survivor who died 2 years ago at close to 90, which is all we were allowed to say. Miriam had lost the 2 sisters with whom she survived the war in a series of concentration camps in Poland. She had lost her precious husband and most of her friends. She coped with chronic pain every day from the many illnesses that afflicted her. She went to the emergency room about every 3-4 weeks. She needed some of the health monitoring services at home so she wouldn't have to go to the emergency room. And yet, Miriam clung to life. She clung to her family. She was the mater familias for all of the children of her sisters who had passed away and all of the grandchildren. And she had a telephone correspondence with a couple of dozen people who called her regularly, weekly, or daily. And they didn't call to check in on Miriam. They called because when you called Miriam, she would say something like, "Tell me something smart the children did today." Who else wants to hear that? She had amazing sage advice. She sang and she danced at the drop of a hat, and she died looking forward to the next joyous occasion. And finally, I want to tell you about my friend Jim, who built the nonprofit organization he founded into an effective and impactful force, only to be sidelined as a younger cohort took over management. I'm sure you've heard stories like that. Jim is bitter. He's losing control and influence. He's hurt that his wisdom and talent are neither appreciated nor tapped. He says, "I know I have to move on, but I don't have any more dreams. This organization was my dream." I love that one. I don't think I could do that now, but I love it. How can we understand that awesome and magnificent journey of later life? And more importantly, what explains how some of us flourish, like my mother-in-law and my friend Jeff, while others founder amidst its challenges? I want this morning to draw on a teaching from the Kabbalah, from the Jewish mystical tradition, in order to frame our experience on the path of later life. I'm so honored and privileged and humbled by the diversity of this gathering. So I want to make it clear that I'm using this teaching from one tradition to illumine what I think is a universal reality. I hope you'll find it relevant and hopeful and helpful, and perhaps be inspired to look into your own faith or tradition to find images, texts, and models to frame the challenges of later life. Here's what we learned from Rabbi Isaac Luria, the great mystical sage of 16th century Israel. The world we live in, the life we have, is born of shattering, which is called shever. this very world was born out of shattering. According to Luria, God wanted very much to create a world, but God found that it was impossible because God filled the universe. There was no room for a world. There was nothing but God. Of course, mystics say, even now, there's nothing but God. But according to Luria's understanding of creation, what happened was God contracted, pulled back, it's called Tzimtzum, and created vessels of matter to be the world. God created a space so that there could be a world, but things did not turn out as God planned. You know the saying, man plans and God laughs? In this instance, God planned and God laughed or cried. There was a devastating cosmic accident. Turns out that God's light could not be contained by these finite vessels that God had created to be the world, and the vessels shattered. The light that was abundant and everywhere before creation became hidden and dispersed, encased in shards of the vessels that were intended to hold it. This is the state of reality ever since. The divine in our world is now limited and concealed in a world of darkness. Our human task, according to Rabbi Luria, is to find and liberate those sparks of the divine, of holiness, that are hidden within the world around us. And as we find those sparks and lift them up, we bring repair or tikkun and redemption to this broken existence. We reclaim the sparks. How is it that we find these sparks? According to Rabbi Luria, it's through mitzvot, which I will define as not commandments, but holy acts of learning, spiritual devotion, and caring connection. So how might this teaching about birth out of brokenness, about shattering and hidden light, be a template for later life? We're going to see that shattering, shever, and tikkun, redemptive repair, play out in the challenges and blessings of later life's journey. Oops. Too fast. In the journey of later life, shatterings are rampant, inevitable, and recurrent. We simply cannot avoid brokenness. This is what's known as the bad news. We will face the shattering of losing dear ones. As we move through later life, we will say goodbye to many, if not most, of our dearest companions. We will likely lose partners, siblings, friends. Some of their deaths will be sudden and tragic. Some will be at a ripe age and peaceful. But nonetheless, their absences leave holes in our hearts and our lives. We'll meet the shatterings of change. Most of us will not work forever, although it might seem that way. And even if we do, our companies or organizations won't stay the same. So our roles won't remain static. If we've been community volunteers or leaders, there comes a time when we have to voluntarily or involuntarily move aside for those who are coming up behind us. Our roles in our family will change. As children and grandchildren grow up, we may not have the central place we once held in their time or attention. A friend of mine who's a very devoted grandmother was out of town for Hanukkah, so she decided she would call in to San Francisco to her family Hanukkah celebration, and she asked them to put her on the speakerphone, and she was really happy and sad to realize that the party was going on just fine without her. If our parents are still around, which many are, by the way, 71% of boomers have living parents, we are suddenly called to care for them, to guide them even when they don't want us to, through complicated and often treacherous choices. More about that later. As parents die, our child role as adult children, as parents die, we lose our child role. As adult children, our parents themselves, our nurturing responsibilities shift. As partners or dear friends become frail or impaired, we become caregivers, not just beloveds sharing life's path. We'll contend with the shattering of disillusionment. Perhaps we'll be crushed by the gap between our youthful idealism and the tenacity of the world's problems. We might become discouraged or cynical. Or perhaps we'll wonder, is this all there is? A friend told me about a colleague she met at an academic conference. This colleague was a tenured professor, quite accomplished, but she was grieving. Why? Because although she'd written 3 books, none had ever been reviewed in the most prestigious journal in her field. This colleague of my friend will never fully meet her expectations and dreams. And I guess we probably won't either completely. Of course, we'll encounter the shattering of the fantasy that will always be well, that will always be independent, that will always be. Our bodies will change. I remember when Cantor Wartell had black hair and a black beard. I had dark hair too. How many of us have done a double take when we looked in the mirror and saw a strange person with unexpected wrinkles or gray hair staring back at us? That's hard, but there will be much harder ahead. Whether it is the subtle loss of name retrieval, or the humbling struggle with chronic illness, or the confrontation with disability and dependency, our habituated ways of being will surely be shattered. In the wake of shattering, the light that was in our lives has been dispersed and it is hidden. At the moment of cataclysm, we cannot perceive it. To use the language of Rabbi Luria, the sparks are encased in shells or shards. When faced with shattering, we feel grief, disgust, fear, anger, abandonment, confusion. Our deepest wish is, why can't it just stay the way it was? In my experience in working with elders, I think that might be the definition of idolatry, the demand that things should stay the way they were. We want to return to Eden. We say, Hashivenu Adonai, take us back there, God. The Benedictine priest Richard Rohr suggests that it is beyond midlife when our life's true purpose could be realized. In the first half of our lives, says Richard Rohr, we're consumed with the construction of the container of life, the outer structures, work, home, family. The second half is where we have the opportunity to become who we are truly meant to be, to construct the essential content of life. Rohr says this shift happens through failings and fallings. We arrive at life's fulfillment only through shatterings. When certainty disintegrates, we are, in the words of Elizabeth Lesser, broken open. And in this way, we become available for real learning and growth. We're wounded by shatterings, and yet we're alive until we're not. Our life as we grow older is thus a new creation, one that emerges out of the shattering. Actually, later life is a series of births out of brokenness. The only existential choice is whether we will dwell in darkness or seek and lift up the sparks of light hidden within our new reality. This is what Rabbi Luria calls tikkun, or repair. I've seen many people who cannot get past a shattering, who remain forever immersed in darkness, despair, and bitterness. I'm sure you have too. But I have also seen the ones who reach for the light. I will never forget Wilma, whom I met when she entered the nursing home where I served as chaplain at age 72, pretty young, after she'd been paralyzed by a stroke. Wilma just happened to be a pip. She made everyone her friend, not just her fellow residents, but anybody she happened to see, family members, staff members, somebody who wandered through the hallways. She would learn your name, and she would never forget it. She was simply a blast to be around. You can imagine that Wilma had many friends in the nursing home. She was a fixture at Shabbat services and a favorite of teens who visited. When a second stroke left Wilma unable to speak and almost totally paralyzed, she was mute, bedfast, apparently unable to communicate in any way. It was as if the entire home had been stricken. As the weeks went by, though, something strange started to happen. Visitors began to sense that Wilma was trying to tell them things. For example, a former student rabbi came to visit and went to Wilma's room, and Wilma kept pointing and gesticulating. And finally, the student sort of followed the trail of Wilma's finger and noticed that it led to a postcard on a bulletin board that this very student had sent to Wilma. So it turned out that Wilma was doing a lot of pointing and gesturing, much of which was incomprehensible. Wilma tried to speak by pointing to letters on an alphabet board to spell the words she wished to say. Eventually, Wilma got out of bed in a jerry chair, in a reclining wheelchair, and she managed to come to the synagogue. You can imagine the reception she received. Her friends greeted her, and she greeted them with tears. Robbed of her speech, Wilma was nonetheless eloquent. She looked quite scary as her face and her body were distorted by the strokes, and she was often, to tell the truth, a tad unkempt. But if you sat next to Wilma for even a moment, she would whip with her good hand out of her bag a little viewer. I don't know if you've ever seen this sort of thing. It's a plastic viewer, and if you held it up to the light, you could see photos. Came from a Catskills resort, probably in the 40s. And in this viewer was this gorgeous, voluptuous young woman with a man sitting by a lake. It was as if Wilma figured out a way to say, "Look at me. I may look strange, even frightening, but I was once beautiful. There are people who love me." Whenever I would see Wilma, without fail, she would sign, "I love you." Wilma was stripped of so many things we count on to make us human. Her speech, her ability to eat, her physical attractiveness. Yet in the face of hardships that would make most people withdraw in anger or frustration, Wilma remained distinctly herself. She found ways to draw others to her with creativity and love and passion. Wilma sought and found the holy sparks. Wilma illuminated the darkness for all she touched. We're getting to the good news. According to the Kabbalah, the path to tikkun, or repair, is through mitzvot, which traditionally means the commandments in Judaism. But I'd like to think about the mitzvot as through invitations to holiness, through practice, through ethical action. These are the pathways to wholeness. One way of thinking about the categories of these pathways is a shorthand suggested by Pirkei Avot, the Ethics of the Fathers, which says, the world is sustained by three things: by learning, or Torah, by avodah, or spiritual practice, and by gemilut chasadim, by carrying connections. I'd like to suggest that the path to sparks of holiness, of wholeness in later life, is through learning and teaching, as embodied by my friend Jeff, who is so enlivened by his study of Musar and painting. The path to wholeness is through worship and spiritual practice, like Wilma and the frail elders in the nursing home I served as chaplain, whose lives took on meaning as we shared the holy rhythms of Jewish time through the cycles of Shabbat and the holidays. And the path to wholeness is through living in caring connection, as demonstrated by my mother-in-law Miriam and by Wilma. These are the dimensions of spiritual vibrancy that draw us to the light and rescue the light from the husks that imprison it. The call, as we grow older, is to open ourselves as never before to these pathways toward connection. We're called to be curious, available, growth-seeking, to find, even amid darkness, opportunities for learning, for praying, for binding ourselves to others and to God. Learning and teaching. We need to find ways as we age to continue learning and growing, to engage in sharing great texts, to share our wisdom, to question and to stretch as people of spirit. One mentor I have is this woman, Ethel, and a group of other women with her in their 80s and 90s who studied for and became bat mitzvah in Brit Sholem House, a senior residence where I had the opportunity to teach Torah for many years. These women, many of them, never had a religious education in their lives. That was something for boys, not for girls at the time. So they studied and they prepared, and they had a ceremony where they had an opportunity to come up to the Torah, as Ethel did there. I'm sorry, it's not a great picture. And to affirm themselves as members of this tradition, as students of Torah, as seekers of meaning. When they did that, they were an inspiration to the other elders in their community. They were also an inspiration to their families, their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren. One of the things they did in the ceremony was that not only did the bat mitzvah women come up to bless the Torah, but they were invited to come with children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. And I'm sure that not one of them will ever forget that profound example. What a way to be a role model. And I want to say that it is my experience that later life is a time when the search for meaning is top of mind, when we are open to questioning, to seeking, to learning as never before. We can also find wholeness through worship and spiritual practice. Oh, I just have to go back for a second. I love this photo. I don't know if you could see it. This is a man with a prayer shawl and phylacteries tefillin who's praying. And right behind him on the bench it says, "For emergency use only." Maybe not. So we might not have been praying people before. I certainly have had the opportunity to accompany lots and lots of elders who were not engaged in observance or religious life in their adult lives, even if that might have been something that they had from their past. But now is the moment to experiment with liturgy and worship and meditation and ritual, with anything that makes this moment meaningful, that brings us into relationship with this moment and with anything that's bigger than ourselves. One thing we can do is create rituals to mark the transitions of later life, whether it's leaving a home of long standing, beginning a new relationship. We can reach into our traditions or others to find spiritual tools that can hold us and sustain us, even when we're all alone, even when we're suffering. We need also, though, to find joy. We need to join together to sing unto God a new song, and even better, to do it old and young together. Finally, we can find the sparks of light through living in caring connection. And I want to sort of reframe this, which really goes along with the quote that Reverend Brooks Cope shared at the beginning, which is we think about caring and elders, and we think about, oh, what's the care that they will receive? But I want to invite us to think about, as we grow older, as we work with others who grow older, whom can I mentor? How can I help? Whom can I teach? What difference can I make now? I visited my spiritual director, who's a sister of mercy, when she was in rehab at a convent nursing home. And the first thing that they had when you walked in the door was a book that you could sign and put in it the names of people that the sisters who were in residence in rehab would pray for. So here are people who are recipients of care. They're frail, they have broken hips, they have all kinds of things wrong with them, but they have a ministry which is to pray for others, and they make every person who's visiting there the recipient of their goodness. We need to keep engaged in giving, in sharing and receiving, whether we're coping with heartbreak or an empty nest, whether we're suffering terminal illness or living with frailty and isolation. We need to be discerning our gifts. We need to help others to discern their gifts and to use them in the context of the multi-generational community. This, by the way, extends to those who are frail and dependent on others. This is my friend Norma Levitt, who must be about 97 now. She's president for life emerita of the Women of Reformed Judaism nationally, and she has worked for many years in the UN with various non-governmental organizations. When Norma spent 3 months in rehab after a grievous fall, she was named by the Princeton Medical Center Patient of the Year. I have a sneaking suspicion that this is an award never given before or since. But knowing the luminous, magnificent person that Norma is, who has the capacity to connect to anyone she meets, I can only imagine that the reason for this award was that Norma found at every turn someone to help, to encourage and guide. And I'm sure that that included the other patients and also the caregivers, maybe the administrators who decided on the award. We need to accompany one another in the journey of aging. And that's something for those of us who are clergy, for those of us who are family members, for those of us who are friends, to do for one another, to walk alongside with one another as we face the brokenness and seek the light. And that capacity to accompany one another is the greatest form of caring. The journey of later life takes us through terrifying and beautiful terrain. We're brought face to face with shattering, with darkness, and with sparks of light and possibilities for redemption. Oops. I love this teaching from Martin Buber. To be old is a glorious thing when one has not unlearned what it means to begin after shattering again and again. The opportunity in this phase of life is to search for the sparks, to learn, to celebrate, to pray, to meditate, to contribute, to find a redemptive path. I want to close with words of blessing that come from Psalm 92. This is an animating vision for later life. And I'm going to sing it, and maybe if I sing it twice, you'll even join in. And take it in as a blessing for you and as a blessing for those you accompany in your work and your family and your community. May we grow fruitful as we age, ripe and abundant and sage. Keep our hearts open to all we face, present to goodness, even a trace. Renew us. Let our spirits soar, sustain us, our rock for more. If you're brave, try it with me. May we grow fruitful as we age, ripe and abundant and sage. Keep our hearts open to all we face, present to goodness, even a trace. Renew us, let our spirits soar, sustain us, our rock for more. Ken Hi Ratzon, so may it be. Thank you so much.
We have time for questions if you're open to that.
Of course.
If you would just repeat the question.
Of course. So I'm told we have a few minutes for questions or comments. I invite you to stand, and I will repeat for everybody else what it is that you said, since it's a big room and hard to hear. Yes.
I'm Julie Conran. I'm an interfaith minister and hospice chaplain. This is so enlightening to help us as we deal with people who are getting close to leaving this world, and to provide some kind of comfort to the families who are left behind. Sometimes we don't get to really relate to the patient, but we certainly are there for the family to give them hope and some kind of inspiration to get them to carry on.
So this was Julie, who's an interfaith minister and hospice chaplain, who said that in her work with people who are at the end of life and with family members, this message she felt could be comforting and empowering. Thank you. Rabbi Re'em. I can hear you fine.
Probably presented resonated so
Thank you so much. Rabbi Re'im said that the message in my talk was really geared toward the individual, about the path toward wholeness and seeking the sparks through this threefold path of learning and spiritual practice and caring. And he asked, what is the role of community in fostering those kinds of opportunities? And actually, that's kind of like, we used to say when we were in seminary and people had to give their senior sermon, we had to be critiqued. We had to stand in front of the faculty and they would give their comments, which were, the sermon that I think you should have given was, and the kind comment was, that's another sermon, but it really is a very important message that I want to share. And here's kind of boiled down the basics, which is the role of the community is to create and foster the opportunities for the individual to find these avenues of learning, of spiritual practice, of caring connection. So I'm going to give you an example which is from a kind of different realm, which is, it's my belief that as a Jewish person, you're obligated to a life of mitzvot, of these invitations to holiness or commandments. From the moment that you take on that obligation, when you come to Jewish adulthood at bar bat mitzvah at 13 or 12, until you die. There's no such thing as a retirement from these life of obligations. But what happens if your capacity is limited? For example, the centerpiece of the 3 worship services a day in Jewish life is a prayer that's called the standing prayer, the Amidah, which is 19 benedictions that you recite standing. So, what if you can't stand? You say them seated. And what if you can't say that lengthy prayer because you don't have the endurance? So there's an abridged version that has the essence of the prayer. And what if you can't say even that? There's a one-line version that's a summary. And what if you can't say anything? You can reflect on it. Now here's the key. If you fulfill the part that you can do to your fullest, you have fully discharged your obligation. You have achieved holiness in this way. You get full credit, in other words. It's a sliding scale of obligation, but you get full credit. And here comes, it seemed like a very long way around, but here comes the answer to Rabbi Re'im's question. Because it turns out that if I, as an individual, am obligated, but I can't do it all the way, it becomes incumbent on the community to facilitate and to do the rest. So, for example, here's a very concrete example, but it kind of paints the story. So, one thing that happens in a Jewish worship service is we read from the scroll of the Torah, the same ones that Reverend Brooks Cope saw when he was a boy in this synagogue in its former location. And when we finish reading, it's an honor to roll up this Torah scroll and wrap it and bind it and put its cover on. So that turned out to be a really great thing. When I was at nursing home Rabbi, that was a great opportunity for somebody who maybe didn't know Hebrew or be scared to say a prayer in front of the community. You could invite somebody to have that honor. So a lot of times I'd invite up somebody who, for example, had hands that were pretty crippled by arthritis, so she couldn't put the binder all the way around and tie it. So we had a binder that had Velcro on the ends. So somebody else, in this case me, would put the binder all the way around the Torah and line it up so that Sophie could affix one end of the Velcro to the other, and she thereby did that mitzvah. She did that holy act. She got the full satisfaction and elevation from doing that holy deed, but it was only possible because for her to do the 10% she could do, somebody else did the 90%. So as we think about any of these kinds of things of learning or sharing one's gifts or engaging in spiritual practice, we need to think about what are the obstacles? Is it physical accessibility? Is it the size of the font on the page? Is it the lighting? Is it transportation? Is it being embarrassed to come in a walker when you used to come in on 2 feet? I remember a woman named Bessie who wouldn't come to the synagogue for the first few weeks that she was in a wheelchair because she said, "This isn't Bessie." It was only when her friends came and sat at the back of the pews where there was space, and they sat next to her. So they affirmed that she was, in fact, still Bessie. So she needed somebody to empower her to do that. And this goes, if you think about activism, I had the opportunity to be a chaplain in a naturally occurring retirement community, a high-rise building in Center City, Philadelphia, filled with retired teachers and social workers and fabulous people who were all in their apartments closed behind the doors. Do you think those people didn't want to change the world? Of course they do. Think about the community organizers who could have used their skills, their wisdom, their knowledge, but it would have taken an awareness that here's a resource to be tapped and we have an obligation to let that light shine. So how about that for a really long answer to Rabbi Reim's question? But it's so important. I think it exists on the congregational level. It certainly exists in communities where older people are in residence in long-term care, to think about what are we doing to empower people to be able to find the light, to shine the light in the way that they can. And what does it take from us to make that empowering happen? So, thank you. What's your name? Tat says that teaching as an elder can be about teaching not in some big community or at a lectern or anything like that, but teaching our intimate ones, teaching our children, teaching our families. And Tat gave the example of teaching her 50-year-old son what she can do and what she can't do, and not assuming that that's clear either way. And I just want to say that I think we have a unique opportunity with the longevity bonus that we have of being children and parents in relationship with one another for decades and decades and decades that isn't necessarily just about caregiving. And in this time, when we may have middle-aged and even aging children in relationship with older parents, there's a possibility for all kinds of learning and all kinds of growing and all kinds of healing. And one of the things that older parents can do for their children who are following them is model willingness to accept help, willingness to be not just independent, but to be interdependent.
What spiritual perspectives and resources do you have to offer for caregivers and children of parents who are suffering from dementia?
The question was, what spiritual resources do I have to offer for children of parents with dementia and spouses? So that is an incredibly important topic. And the first thing I want to say is that it's really, really hard. My father has dementia, so I don't speak about this abstractly. I guess I want to say a couple things. On the one hand, I truly believe that we are all created in God's image. So when we meet that parent who has dementia or that partner who has dementia, they still are beings with the divine in them, even when they are so different than the way that we knew them before. And one of the things that makes it so difficult is the gap between the way that we hold this person maybe and the way that they manifest. This is maybe my spiritual learning for this time of life, which is humility and curiosity. When a person has dementia, they're still there. And they can surprise us with the kind of oases of wholeness. They can surprise us by their capacity to maybe just be in this moment. My friend told about visiting her father in a Masonic nursing home a couple hours from here. And they spent a whole afternoon just sitting at the window watching the birds. And she said it was so peaceful and so whole. And part of the reason that she was able to get to that was that she wasn't asking her father to be what he couldn't be at that moment. She wasn't saying, Dad, you remember ... right? For me, being with my dad, one of the things that's been amazing, first of all, is what's still there. I don't know how this is possible, but my father can still pun, even though he has dementia, which is a really important part of his personality. So it's kind of amazing to sit there, and somebody told him that their son was in Istanbul, and he said, "That's foul." Turkey, foul. It was like a two-stage pun. It's very... And so, just dementia can personality in ways that can be really hard. If you had an elegant mother who's very refined and suddenly she's disinhibited and she's saying words that would never cross her lips, that's very, very difficult. But it can also sometimes uncover maybe the soul part. I mean, I feel like with my father, frankly, what's happened is that a lot of personality and ego has stripped away, except for the punning part. And what's left is love and gratitude. And I hadn't seen those qualities in this way in the healthy version of my father. So curiosity about what might be there is something that I think can be helpful. And humility about our capacity to understand. When people say, she has dementia, she wouldn't understand, or when they talk about somebody when they're in their presence, we don't know. And I just give honor to all of us who are on that journey. I see Reverend Brooks Cope creeping up here, so I want to check in about our timetable.
Thank you.
Thank you.